Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining. Uh, the, pa- the members here are from the CBD Alliance. CBD Alliance is a network of civil society organizations who have common interest in the Convention on Biological Diversity. We try to bring together a lot of organizations who are part of this CBD Alliance and who participate in CBD sessions, who have a lot of knowledge about CBD negotiations. To talk about more about this process and how it happens, we have amazing panel here. Let me introduce Yami Katereri from African Civil Society Biodiversity Alliance. We have Sylvia Ribeiro from ETC Group. We have Helena Paul from EcoNexus, and we have Taiwa Lingam from FOEI Malaysia, Friends of the Earth Malaysia. So you are open to ask any questions, and they are here to answer what's happening and what needs to be done. Thank you.
So shall I start? Okay, so my name is Yamika Terere. I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm a part of the CBD Alliance. And as a CBD Alliance, one of the things that we've been emphasizing very strongly is the fact that the GBF has to address all three objectives of the convention. It is not a conservation convention. It is a convention that deals with sustainable development. So it has to address the issues of access and benefit sharing. It has to address the issues of conservation as well as the issues of sustainable development. And sustainable use within the context of the GBF is really a very powerful concept because it brings together that the notion that you cannot have benefits unless you have conservation, and that you cannot have sustainable use unless you conserve nature. So the GBF has to contribute to societal change. It has to empower local communities, it has to empower indigenous people, it has to empower small-scale farmers. And by empowering these groups, it allows them to be able to adapt to issues of climate change, because climate change has very serious impacts on biodiversity, as well as the vulnerability of these local communities, indigenous people, and small-scale farmers. Through this empowerment, these communities are then able to use their natural resources and biodiversity in a more sustainable manner. And we have to avoid separating people from biodiversity and nature, because of all the groups that understand the complexity of living and managing nature, it is these very groups. And we have to ensure that we don't separate them from the nature. So the global biodiversity framework must embrace the whole approach, the human rights-based approach, with respect to area-based conservation, with issues of agroecology, and how these interventions are designed and implemented. And when we talk about area-based conservation and biodiversity conservation, we have to deal with the issues of justice and equity. As long as we have global injustice between countries and also injustice within countries, it would be very difficult for us to actually address the issue of biodiversity loss. And as we move beyond this COP and we start to look at implementation, we have to look at the instruments that exist that we can take advantage of in terms of the implementation. And one of these instruments that is not currently mentioned within the GBF is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. And that this is really important that this is included, so that we don't separate and just focus on the indigenous people and exclude local communities and the small-scale farmers. So let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Maybe Helena.
We are extremely perturbed at the growing corporate power and control across the UN and across the CBD. There's some very powerful groups of corporations and banks represented here. For example, the World Economic Forum, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, mining, petroleum, and intensive agriculture coalitions, and also increasingly billionaires are represented here as seeking to support biodiversity and indigenous peoples' territories. The problem with this is that they're trying to claim, all these groups, that they can regulate themselves, that they don't need to have governments do this. But unfortunately, also, governments feel that they find it, this is in the global north, they find it a bit of a burden to have to regulate corporations. They'd rather just read their reports. And if those reports pass the test, then that's fine. And in the global south, of course, countries burdened by debt and poverty generally are then faced with the World Bank, for example, trying to force them to accept a large mining company on the basis that the impacts of the mining company can be offset through the many forests or other forms of biodiversity that those countries have. So it's extremely difficult for countries that are deeply in debt to resist that pressure from banks to open up to corporate exploitation. So we see this exploitation continuing, and these companies are often based in rich countries that certainly indirectly benefit from their activities. And while this continues, it's extremely difficult to see how we can actually control what is going on. The other thing is that these corporations are major users of highly confusing terminology, which sounds very persuasive. Things like nature-based solutions, nature positive, net zero, net positive, and so forth. Now, this is meant to replace terminology that's been long accepted and debated in the CBD, like ecosystem approach, which doesn't sound nearly such nice public relations terminology, but actually has a meaning because it has been discussed many times here. Another thing that's involved is greenwashing. That is presenting negative activities such as exploitation. For example, planting monoculture tree plantations is presented as positive. So these tree plantations are presented as carbon sinks to soak up excess carbon dioxide, basically so that so that corporations can continue to emit into the future rather than actually having to stop their destructive activities now, which is what we need. We need cessation of destructive activities now, not at some point in the future. And we have been saying that for the last 35 to 40 years as well. So I think we do rather urgently need it now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Sylvia.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Silvia Ribeiro from ETC Group and also a member of the CBD Alliance. And well, besides what my colleagues here has taken up, I wanted to say that the CBD is a convention that has shown the application of precautionary approach for a long time. So in the past 25 years, we have this UN convention that really has taken decisions to stop really dangerous technologies, like, for instance, Terminator technology already in 2000. It's a biotech technology and extinction technology, and then CBD decided of 2 calls for moratorium on geoengineering technologies, which is climate manipulation. And we have this precautionary approach that has been the basis of CBD. And now what we are very concerned about is that on one hand, we see that there are a lot of growing proposals, for instance, on new biotechnologies, including extinction technologies like gene drives in an era of extinctions, we have technological means of extinguishing even more species and call that as a conservation measure. We also have a range of different false solutions in the form of geoengineering technologies that are being proposed to address both climate and biodiversity crises. So from CBD Alliance and from other networks of concerned organizations in the world, we are requesting that the CBD integrates the precautionary approach and ways of making sure the technology prior assessment and participatory ways of doing this technology assessment. As I mentioned, the CBD has this long history and examples like establishing the Cartagena Protocol, establishing these calls on moratorium. Now it has to go a bit further and ensure that there is a participatory technology prior assessment of technologies before they reach the markets, number one, but also as a way of providing parties with independent evaluation of the technologies, and also to provide what is in the horizon, and that we call it to make sure that there is horizon scanning of new technologies, because otherwise the CBD will be running behind after corporate interest, billionaire interest have put them on the market, and we are suffering the consequences. So the position of the CBD Alliance is we need technology assessment, we need horizon scanning, and we need monitoring of these decisions and implementation of those. And for that, they have to be integrated in the global biodiversity framework and also reaffirm the moratoriums and the calls, the precautionary calls that are already in the CBD. So I will pass the floor to my colleagues, and we are here for more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. May I request Taiwa Lingam from Malaysia to address?
Hello, good afternoon, friends. My name is Deva Lingam from Friends of the Earth Malaysia and part of the larger Federation of Friends of the Earth International and part of the CBD Alliance. We have been repeatedly calling for a very meaningful global biodiversity framework that would actually address the biodiversity crisis, and we have made these repeated calls. Among others, this would include a strong compliance. This should include a strong compliance, assuring where there should be negative consequences for countries who do not follow up on their commitments. However, developing countries need to receive the necessary finance to implement, and developed countries should also be held responsible for not fulfilling their financing obligations. There must be a better mechanism for developed countries to provide massive finance to developing countries, which is a part of their legal obligation under the CBD, which operationalizes the real principle of common but differentiated responsibility through financial obligations on developed countries. Now, it is also their moral obligations based on historical or colonial past and current hour exploitation, often beyond their national jurisdictions. The burden has always been on developing countries to protect biodiversity because it lies mainly in their territories. And in this fora, we have increasingly seen developed countries denying their legal obligations over and over again. Now, this needs to change. And we have already heard repeated calls at the opening plenary today from developing countries for the provision of finance if this GBF is to be successfully implemented. And what we call for is also that finance should be public, new and additional, and does not include private finance. Now, the provision of private finance always comes with strings attached as one of the ways of corporations using this as part of their way of using this to influence the UN process or processes, and for promoting their greenwashing proposals, such as the influence that we are seeing in the provision of finance for example, nature-based solutions. And I just wanted to quickly show you that Friends of the Earth International has just produced a recent report on corporate capture of the CBD, the nature of business, and it explains this and many other corporate capture practices. So please go to our website and you can see it there. Apart from that, we just want to emphasize that the real instruments of destruction are the corporations that pursue profits over people, our planet, and our future. Now, they are the means by which our biodiversity is relentlessly being exploited, concentrating wealth and power into the hands of a few to the detriment of the many. And we heard what Helena had mentioned earlier. Now, we also repeat our calls for the annual flow of 4.6 trillion US dollars in perverse incentives that harm biodiversity to end. Otherwise, governments undermine their own biodiversity commitments. And lastly, we need a very, very strong, coherent implementation mechanism that addresses implementation gaps, reviews progress, and resolves challenges equitably, and a whole of government approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taiva. Thank you, everyone here on the panel. I have one more thing to share. Is CBD Alliance has gathered a lot of recommendations after doing a lot of consultations with various organizations on the ingredient document for the post 2020 global biodiversity framework. It is available in CBD Alliance website, so you can definitely check. And the document contains about each and every goal and each and every target, what should be included, what elements should be addressed in the post 2020 framework. So it will be very highly useful for all the people here to have a look at it. And on that note, I open up here for question Q&A session, please.
Do we have any questions from the floor?
Any questions about what's happening here, and you want to know from the experienced people, like for example, why we are also concerned, and what should be there, so that people should also know. So maybe through your medium it can be highly useful. So I welcome if you have any questions for our speakers here.
Thank you. Virginia Young, Griffith University and the Australian Rainforest Conservation Society. I wonder if you could elaborate on the mechanisms required to actually prevent further damage and loss to natural ecosystems, which, as you rightly say, has long been called for and where we've seen too little action. But could you elaborate on exactly what mechanisms you think would be most effective to bring about that change?
Well, one rather large matter is the power imbalance, because the global north is saying biodiversity should be conserved, but it doesn't seem prepared to take the steps that are necessary to conserve that biodiversity, i.e. to cease destructive activities of its own, which continue at a major level all over the world, and to provide the finance that's required on the basis of common but differentiated responsibilities. And that is also not happening. And so the major actors in this who are not acting are the global north countries, the EU and Canada, the United States. You know, all these major countries are not doing what they should be doing if we really want to reverse biodiversity loss. And we've reached such a point of crisis now that if we don't act now, we are going to tip over into a very dangerous era indeed.
I can add something to that. And from the point of view of this about technology transfer, you know, we always, in all conventions, we speak about finance and also transfer of technologies. And our proposal to go to the root causes also, like is this about affirming there is a proposal already to create a multilateral expert group on technology horizon scanning and technology evaluation. And we think this should be in place to not be like taking the CBD by surprise with every technology. But also we need to affirm, and for instance, there has been proposals all over the text to just have technology transfer, and also they have introduced the word science, technology, and innovation. That may sound good for some people, but in reality, this is meant to exclude the main actors of biodiversity. The main actors of biodiversity, the conservers, the creators of biodiversity, are indigenous peoples, local communities, particularly peasant and farmers communities, and those are also the responsibles for producing the majority of the food of the world. So they have an incredible important role, and this is among, you know, the root solutions to many things, to the biodiversity crisis, to climate change, to food crisis. So the CBD should affirm the participation and the well-being of these groups, number one, and also making sure that there is mechanism for permanently assessing what it is in the horizon, how it can be prevented, and inform, free of conflict of interest, of corporate and billionaires' conflict of interest, informing the parties about the risk of the technologies, but also the many proposals for good technologies and other knowledge systems and ways of working that can guarantee to restore biodiversity, to have a better and to prevent erosion of biodiversity.
Just add to that?
Yeah.
And also, if you want to know more on this, please, we have this document at etcgroup.org, which is about how to protect this legacy of precaution in CBD.
Okay. Maybe last comment, and we have.
Yeah, so I think just picking up on that point, one of the things that we don't actually talk about is the whole issue of the CBD tends to talk about the dealing with the issues rather than dealing with the underlying causes of biodiversity loss. So we avoid having conversations about the disproportionate ecological space that is occupied by the global north and how unsustainable consumption patterns actually drive the loss of biodiversity. But also the issue of inequities between countries and within countries. And unless we can confront and deal with the issues of social justice and inequities, I think that it will be very difficult for us to address biodiversity loss. So we talk about creating more protected areas, but we're not trying to understand why we've not been able to manage the existing protected areas. So the effectiveness of the existing protected areas is not being discussed. Why don't we have a target on protected area effectiveness, but we have a target on 30 by 30? So I think these are the issues that we need to be able to discuss and confront.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving this wonderful opportunity. I thank all the speakers here, and thank you for the questions, ladies and gentlemen. Take care.